So, welcome to today's Colin Gray Memorial Lecture in Geostrategic Analysis. Dr. Michaela Dodge will discuss addressing challenges to Allied assurance in an emerging tripolar nuclear environment. Dr. Dodge is currently a research scholar at the National Institute for Public Policy. Prior to joining the National Institute, Dr. Dodge worked at the Heritage Foundation from 2010 to 2019. Her last position at Heritage was Research Fellow for Missile Defense and Nuclear Deterrence. She left the Heritage Foundation to serve as Senator John Kyle's Senior Defense Policy Advisor from October to December 2018. Dr. Dodge has written extensively on nuclear weapons policy, ballistic missile defense, and arms control. She has published a book examining U.S. allied post-Cold War relations and Russian influence operations entitled U.S.-Czech Ballistic Missile Defense Cooperation, Alliance Politics in Action. In 2019, she earned a Ph.D. from George Mason University. Before we begin, please note that the Mackinder Forum observes the Chatham House rule. Feel free to discuss the information presented, but neither identify the name or affiliation of any of the speakers or other session attendees. Dr. Dodge has agreed to have her talk recorded for eventual posting to YouTube. Ms. Clay, our Director of Programming, will stop recording when the Q&A period begins. Finally, during our question and answer period, please raise your virtual hand to be placed on the queue. Ask one question at a time, and time permitting, we will circle back to those who wish to ask a second question. So with all that, Dr. Dodge, please.
Thank you so much to the Mackinder Forum for hosting me today. I'm really glad to be able to participate. And it's a special honor to speak at the Colin Gray Memorial Lecture Series. Colin Gray founded my home think tank, the National Institute for Public Policy. And we miss him sorely and continue to extensively draw on his scholarship, which is a testament of the quality of thought that he left us with. My topic today is addressing challenges to Allied assurance in an emerging tripolar nuclear environment. A majority of that presentation is going to be drawing on an upcoming occasional paper that I've been working on for a better part of the past 6 months. So you're getting sort of an exclusive preview, and I'm looking forward to our discussion and thoughts on the topic. The analysis draws on interviews that I conducted with experts in Japan, South Korea, and several NATO countries. I did not include Taiwan since we've done a special large comprehensive study on deterring conflict in the Taiwan Straits fairly recently, and I didn't include Israel since it's sort of its own special case. First, I'm going to discuss briefly the context in which the United States manages its alliance relations and the challenges that this context generates for successfully doing so. Second, I'll discuss the main findings from the interviews. And third, I wouldn't be in DC if I weren't to provide policy recommendations on how to move forward. The international audience will forgive that the recommendations are mostly focused on the United States government. First, the international context. The context in which the United States is managing its alliance relations is unprecedented. And I'm well aware that, the word is somewhat overused in our discourse. Much has been written lately about the rapid deterioration of the national security environment. There is China's breathtaking nuclear buildup. There is Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These are fundamental developments that require a wholesale reevaluation of the US approach to nuclear deterrence, allied assurance, and management. The problem of maintaining deterrence, as difficult as it was during the Cold War, is more complex today, not just because of China, but also because of the emergence of new nuclear powers, including North Korea. Until fairly recently, and some would argue that we are still in this state, the United States has checked out from a nuclear competition. And it shows on its programs, on its modernization programs, and its decrepit nuclear infrastructure. Meanwhile, North Korea continues to advance nuclear weapon and missile programs. It's staging exercises simulating a tactical nuclear attack. It's collaborating with Russia in exchange of material and diplomatic support for Moscow's activities in Ukraine. Russia has nuclear superiority over the United States. Take it from the horse's mouth. Putin recently noted that, quote, "We have more such weapons than NATO countries. They know about it and never stop trying to persuade us to start nuclear reduction talks. Like hell we will, right?" A popular phrase. Because putting it in the dry language of economic essays, it is our competitive advantage. End quote. And Russia has used this advantage, to deter and slow down Western support for Ukraine. While Russia, China, and North Korea are likely expanding and improving their respective nuclear capabilities, discussions in the United States are usually about whether we keep too many nuclear weapons, or whether nuclear weapons disparities matter at all. And let us not forget our pathological obsession with arms control. Second, and this was a sort of a gist of the work that we've been carrying out at NIPP on alliance politics, but how are US allies thinking about these developments, especially in relations to US assurance? And after Russia's February 22 invasion, in some ways these questions became more salient, not just in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific. And that is because the United States was one of the guarantor states of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the '94 Budapest Memorandum. In the document, Ukraine acceded to the nonproliferation treaty and gave up nuclear weapons on its territory in exchange of a pledge that its independence, sovereignty, and existing borders will be respected. Now, since then, Ukraine's foreign minister indicated it was a mistake for Ukraine to agree to the memorandum, and former President Clinton said he regretted his role in making Ukraine give up nuclear weapons. Now, we might have a discussion about whether that was appropriate for the time and how the situation could have been different. Nevertheless, the optics and the narrative is not conducive to US non-proliferation goals, so to speak. Now, even though US guarantees to Ukraine are comparatively weaker than those made in other US alliance treaties, countries are closely observing the dynamic of US help. The conflict is somewhat of an indicator of the likelihood the United States would come to allies' defense. On one hand, Ukraine is not a formal ally. On the other hand, the conflict does not require the United States to be directly involved, in a sense of sending its own troops into harm's way. And in theory, providing material help should be easier politically than conflict requiring boots on the ground. During the Cold War, the United States invested significant resources to mitigate perceived gaps in its extended deterrence and assurance. These included hundreds of thousands of troops forward deployed and tens of thousands of nuclear warheads in Europe, the primary area of concern at the time. Now, after the end of the Cold War, we experienced a period of unquestioned US leadership in the New World Order. Many hoped this would mark the end of a nation-state conflict, large defense budgets, and nuclear competition. Defense might that America spent decades building up was dismantled in a few years, and the defense industrial base atrophied. The prospect for its reconstitution are bleak in the short term, even if Russia's February 22 invasion is serving to a degree as a wake-up call. Practically speaking, from perspective of many of our allies, there is no viable alternative to the United States being the primary guarantor of their security. And that is why some of them think that questioning US credibility publicly would be pointless, and perhaps could even send a wrong message to adversaries and increase risks to NATO's frontline allies. After all, 80% of NATO's defense expenditures comes from non-EU NATO allies. They would have to spend much more on defense than they currently are to achieve a similar degree of capability, and that takes into account the investments or the increases in the past couple of years. It would take significant time and effort to develop key conventional enablers, for example, airlift, that the United States currently provides. Allies could develop their own nuclear capabilities, and that's a prospect that we've seen discussed more often today than in the past 10 or so years. But even that option is fraught with its own political, diplomatic, and fiscal difficulties. Lastly, they could collaborate with adversaries, and that's an option perhaps most damaging to US interests. Hungary and Slovakia appear to be choosing this route, with Russia and also China, potentially creating difficulties for NATO, which customarily operates by unanimous agreement. It's not a formalized unanimous agreement. Openly questioning US commitments warrants rather unpleasant follow-up questions. So if the United States cannot guarantee allied security, which other country or combination of countries could do so? The alternatives entail large costs that the publics are unlikely to support, at least in the near term. Striking a separate deal with an adversary has all the markings of a future disaster. Although the pro-Russian shifts in Hungary and Slovakia shows a concerning degree of plausibility regarding this scenario. Germany, with years of pursuing cooperative policy toward Russia, has learned the hard way that attempts at reconciliation bring more discord when strategic objectives and perceptions are fundamentally at odds. Now, let alone opening one up to intelligence penetration. It is somewhat strange that Germany is not applying this hard-obtained knowledge to its relations with China, and that's a matter of significant concern to some other NATO countries and the United States. Another aspect is that really the nuclear part of Allied assurance is really not well understood among many Allied politicians, even though all DoD operational plans, all conventional operational plans, assume that strategic deterrence holds, and actually tactical deterrence too. Now, just like the United States, allies too took a break from thinking about nuclear deterrence after the end of the Cold War. In fact, states that joined NATO after the end of the Cold War hasn't really had to think seriously about it until recently. Many politicians in allied countries appear to take the credibility of nuclear deterrence for granted. They assume it's kind of always there, it's always working, and it doesn't really need to be thought of on an everyday basis. And perhaps these attitudes are a variable of these countries not possessing nuclear weapon capabilities themselves. They just implicitly trust that nuclear powers know what they're doing with nuclear weapons. Rather than focusing their primary attention on nuclear guarantees, they are quick to point out the value of a steady US conventional forward presence. Permanent, if possible, rotational, if need be, and in the case of allies in Europe, from other NATO countries when US forces are not available. Now, from sort of my perspective as nuclear weapon expert or nuclear policy expert, there might be a silver lining to so few politicians understanding the nuances of US nuclear policy and infrastructure that supports it. And that is that US nuclear modernization is already running into difficulties. The US nuclear production complex is in a sorry state. And I think that perhaps allied politicians would not feel as assured if they wholly comprehended the serious problems that follow decades of neglect of this particular part of US extended deterrence. A few interviewed experts raised concerns about whether the United States will be able to sustain its nuclear weapons modernization program, a program which is desperately needed. There is a discussion about the Biden administration maybe canceling the Sea-launched cruise missile that our regional allies see as valuable because they see paths to breaking down nuclear deterrence in a regional context. The sort of experts more attentive to US nuclear developments are concerned about quantity of US nuclear warheads, about their quality, as in what kind of weapons effects we are looking at, and they're looking at modes of deployment. So we do not have very good diversity in terms of delivery systems in the tactical nuclear weapons part of our nuclear deterrent. There really should be greater urgency to change things from a political perspective, but we are not there yet. In a way, nuclear deterrence is a victim of its own success. The tacit assumptions, and they're not wrong per se, are that at first nuclear deterrence is working, and it's working in its most important aspect, as in preventing a nuclear attack against the US homeland and against allies. Second, because it is working, it does not need to be questioned publicly or discussed very much. And sometimes over the Atlantic, this becomes US allies are not really worried or concerned about US nuclear weapons, and so we can get rid of them. Third, the United States, the UK, and France know what they're doing with their nuclear arsenals, and it's not really allied governments' place to comment on the particulars. At the end of the day, US taxpayers bear consequences of US armament choices, and the details of that posture have to be worked out within the US political process. But of course, that doesn't mean that these decisions are unimportant to allies. The relative success of nuclear assurance contrasts with allied concerns over whether the United States maintains sufficient conventional capabilities to be able to uphold its global obligations. The principal question is whether it has enough forces to support both alliances in Europe and Indo-Pacific, particularly amidst conflict. The related question is how would it prioritize capabilities if it needs to do so? And how steadfast would be its commitment to both theaters? European allies are worried about US focus on China, and allies in the Indo-Pacific worry that US focus on Ukraine will diminish US attention to the Indo-Pacific. The 2023 Strategic Posture Commission report stated that if the United States and allies do not field sufficient conventional forces, US strategy would need to be altered to increase reliance on nuclear weapons to deter or counter opportunistic or collaborative aggression in the other theater. Now, when it comes to defense capability, the United States is self-inflicting some of these woes. This fiscal year, which by the way started at the end of September of the previous year, the Congress's inability to pass a regular budget is costing the Department of Defense close to $300 million a day. The last time Congress passed defense budget on time was in 1997, and I think last regular budget was probably 2007 or something like that. It's been a while. The potential need for prioritization may be at the expense of one region over another. That makes allies nervous. And this nervousness is made worse by US think tank and advocacy pieces proposing to focus more on one region over another. Again, while few politicians understand the nuances of nuclear weapons policy, those conventional forces are a visible sign of US willingness to come to allied defense with more than diplomatic démarches. And again, that's why one of the key elements of assurance in the eyes of interviewed experts was to maintain US forward deployed forces at least at the current level or very close to it. Potential problem that we're going to be facing is that European NATO members are not uniformly in agreement on the degree of threat, even if they agree so in public statements. If defense spending levels are a reasonable approximate for a state's threat perception, only 18 member states are expected to hit the benchmark of 2% of GDP for defense in 2024. And that's up from 11 that met the threshold in 2023. On the other hand, countries that did not meet the benchmark in 2023 include some of the richest members of the alliance, like France or Germany. I know there's much to be criticized about setting 2% of GDP as a benchmark against which to judge whether a country is meeting its defense obligation or whether that's sufficient to provide for its defense. But the threshold was formalized voluntarily among all NATO member states after Russia's 2014 invasion of Crimea in Ukraine, prior to further deterioration in Europe's security environment. Which of course begs the question, why is 2% enough today when we are facing much worse security environment? Some people say that states' budgets cannot absorb increases in a short period of time. Okay, it's been 10 years. The challenge really is to spend well, not just to spend resources. Nevertheless, though, because Europeans ignored their defense needs for so long, even if they increase defense budgets, they have to recapitalize before building new capabilities. For some NATO members, this creates an interesting problem where in Washington, D.C., they're being lumped into the basket with all those other NATO member states that are not spending 2% of GDP on their defense. So they're effectively victims of Germany's and France's not paying enough. And obviously, US security guarantees to NATO members ought not to depend on how much Germany spends on its defense budgets. At the same time, it's creating this interesting problem that the more assured allies feel, the safer they feel, the more certain of US help they feel, the less they want to spend on defense. And so in this context, I think it's interesting to ask whether the latest increases can be interpreted as an indicator of diminishing trust in US security guarantees. Or could the UK's recent decision to increase the nuclear warhead cap reflect a perception that US nuclear deterrent is becoming stretched too thin? Now, another interesting argument occurred in these interviews, and that was that whether Russia is a threat to NATO at all, given the abysmal performance of its forces in Ukraine. And they argue that irrespective of Moscow's imperialistic rhetoric, in fact, they didn't consider Russia an imperial power, Russia remains a serious threat only to its non-NATO members, such as Georgia or Moldova. On the other hand, the prospect of Ukraine losing undoubtedly increases NATO states' collective perception of danger. Russia's capability loss in Ukraine means that it is less of a direct conventional threat to US Indo-Pacific allies. But it is likely that Russia will increase reliance on nuclear forces, including in the European theater, and that will create new problems for NATO. The alliance has grown to see US tactical nuclear weapons as a political rather than a military tool. The disparity in NATO member states' perceptions has the potential to cause intra-alliance tensions. Many countries in Europe just wish that war would just kind of go away. They say the right things, they do the right things symbolically for Ukraine, but they're not willing to do real things and explain them to their electorate, as one of our interviewees summed up the situation. Obviously states that are more threatened are those closer to Russia, those that used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, and they tend to be among the poorer members of the alliance. They ask, well, or maybe are bound to ask in the near future, well, we are not the richest members of the alliance. Why are we spending all these resources on defense while, while the Belgians continue to spend on their social programs? And so far, there is a societal consensus on the need to spend on defense. But to me, it seems that it's a cleavage that's kind of ripe for exploration by Russian disinformation operations. And because remaining cohesive is important, there isn't really much an appetite for airing these grievances in the public. Countries don't like that others spend less, but there doesn't seem much to be done on the intra-European level. Again, as one of my colleagues told me. There are massive challenges to having a sound public debate about these issues. In general, that debate is rather poorly informed, and the nuclear aspect is just very poorly informed. Allied states face the problem of paucity of military officers and representatives who are conversant on issues related to nuclear deterrence. Sometimes regional experts are not knowledgeable about nuclear policy issues and vice versa. There's also a generational divide between people who started their careers during the Cold War and those who started their careers during the post-Cold War era. The Cold War era experience is not always applicable to today's challenges. The post-Cold War crowd seems to be very interested in nonproliferation and disarmament, but maybe less interested in making deterrence work in a practical sense. There's also a good deal of allies who prefer to avoid public debate about all things relevant to national security, because their publics would not support the ongoing budgetary increases if these increases were spotlighted and somehow made it into the general discourse. But lately, debates about influence and importance of nuclear weapons have become more common, especially in the context of Russia brandishing the nuclear threats against the United States and NATO. Large concern on US allied for US allies is US domestic polarization. And that was a challenge that just kept coming up over and over and over again. And I think this has to do with unpredictability and uncertainty that polarization brings into the US political process. And we are seeing the effects real time, with Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, refusing to put further military assistance to Ukraine up for a vote. And the Russians have already been able to take advantage of US assistance delays on the battlefield and make gains in Ukraine. Polarization also erratic erratic decision-making, as witnessed by a lack of enforcement of red lines in Syria during the Obama administration. Just so I don't, poke just only the Republicans. And more recently, we of course had the Biden administration hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan that damaged allied perceptions of US credibility. Now, you could make the case that there are short-term benefits to being erratic and unpredictable, but also the very same features are a significant long-term obstacles to alliance credibility. Several experts were very concerned about President Donald Trump's transactional management style. Interesting to me was that this concern was independent of the actual policy implementation of the Trump administration and the US government. In some way, it was almost as if the president's statements were the only substance that the US foreign policy had. And they definitely had a disproportional impact on how allies perceived US collective willingness to come to their defense. Now, of course, I recognize that it's difficult to understand US policymaking process and all the different bits and pieces that feed into it and different actors that shape it, and especially actors that are often at odds with each other. But it was interesting that in DC, you pay attention to programs and capabilities, and you look at the budgets and how that matches with the rhetoric, whereas that aspect just wasn't as prominent in foreign countries. Third, what do we do about it? We are in a position to take some steps that can improve some of our US assurance efforts. And it's likely that we would find willing partners, especially on nuclear issues, because US allies really do tend to follow where the United States leads. And we've seen this over and over again, and I think perhaps the most prominent example in recent years is missile defense, where we went from missile defenses being completely destabilizing and terrible to NATO agreeing that missile defenses support deterrence and assurance. And that was the Bush administration's advocacy, and that was the Bush administration leaving the ABM treaty, and the Obama administration continuing the narrative to some degree. And so, interviewed experts emphasized the value of the United States promoting and sustaining communication with allied governments. Generally speaking, the more communication channels, the better. The higher the representative from the US government, the better. To US allies, communication and US declarations could be just as important as the makeup of forces the United States deploys in support of its global commitments. It helps to build trust, especially over time. There are other types of communication that can be valuable. So those can be articles by US government officials in foreign media, press releases showcasing capabilities of a particular weapon system and how it contributes to allied security. In the NATO context, obviously, it's the reiteration of the Article 5, particularly by the president. And he is the most preferred person to articulate these types of security guarantees. The United States ought to do so often and unequivocally. That word, you know what I mean. Lest Russian leaders think that they might have a window of opportunity to attack NATO. Somewhat painfully, and again, this has been a consistent problem that we've seen over and over and over again. The US government and allied governments too we lack skilled communicators that can connect with the journalist, with the publics, and sort of the lower level of political representatives in allied countries. Generally, national security communities are small. Nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, nuclear nonproliferation communities are even smaller. US allies welcome US lead on these discussions. When nuclear matters are on the agenda at the US government insistence, then the allied governments are forced to find somebody who is a substantive expert. This efforts, the joint cooperation could help to explain the importance of US nuclear guarantees to the political representatives, who then could communicate more effectively with the public. That bench of nuclear experts should be deep enough to serve politicians regardless of political affiliation or party in power. There was some disagreement, and obviously it was country-dependent disagreement, on whether it's worth it to have this discussion on nuclear deterrence. Partly because of polarization that these issues generally stir, and partly because of a general low level of information among the electorates. A discussion split a ruling coalition and could split a ruling coalition and further diminish the fragile support for the necessary defense budget's increases. Now, my perspective on that is that if we do not have that discussion, the adversaries are going to have the discussion instead of us. And again, we've seen that with the politicization of missile defense issue in the Czech Republic that I've worked with. And that was exactly what happened. The government seized the narrative. They just didn't have any communication plan to speak of. And so the Russians seized the initiative, and the Czech government and the US government just never managed to keep up. The informed debate could also mitigate politicians' ill-informed and ill-coordinated quips that then cause challenge to assurance. And as I said that, you probably could have thought about 2 or 3 instances when this happened. The allies that have invested in trying to understand US nuclear weapons policy, and in recent decades, that's in the past perhaps 15 years or so, that's been the case with Japan. What they're interested now is how do we operationalize the relationship between nuclear and conventional weapons? And it's a big question in South Korea too. And they are trying to work out how do we do joint planning, how do we do operations, how do we contribute to allied assurance. And this discussion impacts our combatant commands that have to work with the strategic command and sort of figure out how the strategic operational plans can work in a regional context. And so far, we haven't done as much work as we need to on that topic. Pitch for missile defense. I think missile defense is going to become a more important topic in allied relations because of Russia's use of unmanned systems, indiscriminate shelling, and ballistic missiles and cruise missiles against targets in Ukraine. Here, the United States has a major role to play in terms of capability, but also policy, even if its capabilities cannot fully match Russia's or China's strategic arsenal. Next, and this was a little puzzling to me, and here you see nuclear policymaking brain working. Allies were really interested in having visible demonstrations of US nuclear presence on their territory. So several people in South Korea mentioned how good it was that the United States sent a potentially nuclear-armed submarine to Busan in South Korea. Even though when the submarine emerges and is in port, it is at its most vulnerable. And so to me, I was thinking, why would it contribute to assurance when the whole point of having a submarine is that it's submerged and you don't know where it is? But you see that sometimes these things are not necessarily logical. I think there was a big desire to sort of try to generate more unpredictability from NATO to the Russians to strengthen peacetime deterrence, to do more of what we are doing. And we will have a unique opportunity with so many countries purchasing the F-35 fighter. If it is a NATO member state, then those fighters could contribute to NATO's nuclear burden sharing. And perhaps they could even plan on purchasing nuclear certified fighters to further complicate Russia's calculus and to improve potential survivability. Countries that join NATO after the end of the Cold War might be interested in expanding their participation in NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements up to hosting US nuclear forces. Now, of course, they could also increase their participation in military exercises that include a nuclear component. They could participate in the Snowcat program. NATO could designate several Polish airfields as potential dispersed operating bases to provide additional dispersal options, again, to complicate Russia's targeting and increase survival and sortie rates. Now, thankfully, arms control is taking a back seat. And I said that our obsession with arms control tends to be pathological, and I think you still see it pretty much regardless of how much Russia threatens United States and allies. Just how bad the political relations are, the answer always seems to be that we need more arms control because these relations are so terrible, as if arms control could fix the political relationship. But of course, as Colin Gray would say, arms control is about politics. It cannot fix the political relationship, it just reflects it. And so we really shouldn't push arms control against all common sense. And frankly, I think most of our allies would not be happy with us trying to push more arms control. Maybe the only silver lining would be that we could tell countries in the third world that we are trying to have arms control with the Russians and try to kind of spin it into some kind of public relations campaign or something. But given how terrible we are at these things, I don't think it's worth it. It seems that the downsides far outweigh any potential upsides at this point. And of course, we really shouldn't be doing these things right now without informing allies about the process. There was a heavy emphasis too on allies desiring no changes to U.S. declaratory policy at this time, and that was in the context of Vice President Biden and candidate Biden endorsing no first use policy. But to its credit, the Biden administration refrained from that change in the nuclear posture review. So that's good. Now, with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the debate.